Hi everybody, I wanted to give you all a quick review of rounding before we move on because you're going to need it in several chapters in this course, and so it's definitely worth the time just to run through some of these concepts. So basically you're going to be asked multiple times to round things to the nearest something. Sometimes it might be the nearest tenth, the nearest hundredth, the nearest thousandth, or instead of saying tenths, hundredths, or thousandths, they might say round to 1 decimal place, or round to 2 decimal places, or round to 3 decimal places. But either way, you need to know how to do that. So just remember that if the decimal is here, the first spot is the tenths place, the second is the hundredths place, and the third is the thousandths place. The general rule of rounding is if the number after the place you are rounding to is 5 or greater, then you round up to the next number. So here's an example. If we have 87.146291, then we want to round it to the nearest tenth. That means we only want 1 decimal place to remain after we round. We want only the tenths place to still be there after we round. So we look at the number after that, we look at the second decimal place, the hundredths place, and we ask ourselves, is that 5 or bigger? Since it's a 4, we know that we are going to let this stay a 1 and not round it up to 2. So this number rounded to the nearest tenth is 87.1. Now if we wanted to round this number to the nearest hundredth, that means we want 2 decimal places to remain after we round. So we're going to look at the third decimal place, and since that is 5 or bigger, it's a 6, so it's bigger than 5, that means this decimal will round up from a 4 to a 5, and our final answer is 87.15 if we round that to the nearest hundredth. Then, if we wanted to take this number and round it to the nearest whole number, that just means we don't want any decimals. We want to find the nearest number without any decimal places. And so we're going to look at the very first decimal place, and if it's 5 or bigger, we will round to 88. If it's 4 or smaller, we'll keep it at 87. So in this case, to the nearest whole number is 87. In this question, you're being asked to round up to the nearest whole number, and it's really important to pay attention to the fact that it says up, because this is different than just rounding. If you want to round up, that means regardless of what this decimal is, even if it's really small, like a 1, it doesn't have to be 5 or bigger, you're still going to round up. So that's important to pay attention to. So we have no decimals after the decimal point since we're looking at the nearest whole number, and because it says to round up, this is actually going to round up to 88, even though this is a 1. So it's important to pay attention to the directions as to whether or not you're rounding, which is typically you'll just be rounding, but some questions in this class will be asked to round up. So just be sure to pay attention to that. We can also be asked to round to the nearest dollar, so that's exactly like rounding to the nearest whole number. We shouldn't have any decimals after the decimal point, which means no cents, only dollars. So since the first decimal is a 5, that means we will round this up to $44. So now you try it. I'm going to give you a number and tell you to round it to a certain place, but make sure that you pause the recording so that you can see if you got it right. If you round 293.675 to the nearest tenth, what do you get? Pause the video Hopefully you got 293.7. This is because the number after the 6 was 5 or bigger. It was bigger than 5, so the 6 rounds up to a 7. Now round 293.513 to the nearest tenth. Pause the video. You should get 293.5. It stays at 0.5 because the number after the 5 is a 1, which is smaller than 5. Round 675.81378 to the nearest hundredth. Remember that the hundredths place is the second spot. Pause the video. Hopefully you got 675.81. The 1 stays a 1 because the number after the 1 is a 3. Because we're rounding to the nearest hundredth, that means we only want 2 decimal places, and this third number is a 3, so it stays as a 1. Now what if we round this to the nearest hundredth? Pause the video. You should get 675.88. The 7 rounds up to an 8 because the number after the 7 is a 6, which is 5 or bigger. So this 7 rounds up to an 8. Now rounding to the nearest thousandth, or the instructions just might say round to 3 decimal places. That's the same idea. So we're either going to have 876 or 877. We decide based on the fourth number. Pause the video. You should get 975.876. The 6 stays a 6 because the number after it is a 1. Round to the nearest dollar, $52.38. You should get $52 because the number after the decimal point was smaller than 5, so this stays $52. Round to the nearest dollar. You should get $32 because the number after the decimal point was bigger than 5. Round to the nearest whole number. Pause the video. You should get 673 because the number after the decimal point was bigger than 5. So this rounds to 673. Round to the nearest whole number. You should get 672 because the number after the decimal point is a 2, which is smaller than 5, so this stays 672. Now what about rounding up to the nearest whole number? It is very important to notice that word up. If it says round up, that means no matter what the decimal is, you round up. So what do we get if we round up? You get 673. Even though that decimal is just a 2 and it's not bigger than 5, the instructions said to round up. Round up to the nearest whole number. Pause the video to make sure that you get it before you see the answer. You should get 835. Even though this is a 0.2, you're asked to round up. Now, these are a little bit more tricky. Sometimes people aren't quite sure what to do if you have a 9 in the spot that you're rounding. So let's take a look at this. We're rounding to the nearest tenth. That means we can only have one decimal place. But this 7 in the hundredths place is going to make this 9 round up. So what happens when this 9 rounds up? It rounds the ones place up to a 4. So the answer is 294.0. Now, even though we wouldn't normally put 0.0 since they specifically said round to the nearest tenth, that means we do need to show a tenths place. So we're showing that the tenths place is a 0 because this 9 forced the 3 to round up to a 4. $348.963 rounded to the nearest tenth. Same idea. This 9 so did you get 349.0? Hopefully you did, because this 6, because it's bigger than 5, caused this 9 to round up. Since there's nothing to round 9 up to, it forces the 8 to become a 9. Round to the nearest hundredth. That's 2 decimal places. If we want to round this to 2 decimal places, we need to look at the third decimal place to decide whether we round up or whether we stay the same. Okay, since the 9 needs to round up and there's nothing to round 9 up to, that forces the 6 in the tenths place to become a 7. So 293.70. Round to the nearest hundredth. So again, we've got 2 decimal places that we want to end up with. So we look at the third decimal place to see if we need to round. Did you get 741.90? That 5 forced the 9 to round up. And since there's nothing for that to round up to, it forces the 8 to round up to a 9. 741.9953 rounded to the nearest hundredth. This can also be very tricky for some students because they know that we need to keep 2 decimal places. See what you get when you round this to the nearest hundredth. So here we have the 9. When we look at this 5, we know the 5 is going to force this 9 to round up. Because 9 can't go up to anything, it forces the place to the left of it to round up, but that's a 9 also. So now that 9 needs to round up, but we can't round up a 9 to anything, so that forces the place to the left of it to round up. So 742.00. Yes, the 0.00 is meaningless as far as the value, but we're showing that we did keep the hundredths place. We kept 2 decimals, and because both of those 9s rounded up, we're at 742.00. Let's try one more. Nearest whole number. Nearest whole number, and let's see what you get. Okay, so if we're looking for the nearest whole number, that means we don't want any decimals. So we look at the first decimal place to see if this 9 needs to round up. Since 8 is bigger than 5, this 9 needs to round up. Well, we can't round a 9 up. It would round to 10, which forces this 9 to also round up, which forces this 2 to round up as well. So 300 is the answer, rounding this to the nearest whole number. I hope that this helped you guys with reviewing these rounding concepts, and that it will help you throughout the course.